Los Angeles, 1971. Rain had been falling over Chinatown since late afternoon, washing the streets in silver and turning the neon signs into trembling reflections on the pavement. Inside a small Chinese restaurant, hidden between two narrow buildings, the atmosphere was completely different. Warm, quiet, almost peaceful. The smell of roasted duck, steamed rice, ginger, and hot tea filled the room. Conversations remained low, and the clinking of porcelain bowls created a soft rhythm beneath the music, playing from an old radio behind the counter. At a table near the back wall, Bruce Lee sat alone. He wore a dark blue traditional Chinese jacket with white cuffs. His meal was simple: a bowl of rice, vegetables, some fish, and a pot of tea. For once, Bruce wasn't training. He wasn't teaching. He wasn't demonstrating. He simply wanted to eat. But Bruce had chosen the wrong night for peace. Because at exactly 9:17, the restaurant doors opened. The conversation stopped. A cold silence moved through the room. 5 men entered. 4 were bodyguards. The 5th man walked between them. His name was Vincent Moretti. At least, that was the name people used when they were brave enough to say it. Moretti controlled gambling rooms, protection businesses, underground fights, and several illegal operations across parts of Los Angeles. He was known for buying loyalty, destroying opposition, and making people disappear from his business without anyone asking questions. He wore an expensive black suit beneath a long gray overcoat. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of his face. He didn't need to announce himself. Everyone already knew who he was. The restaurant owner immediately rushed forward. "Mr. Moretti, welcome." Moretti barely looked at him. "Private table." "Yes, sir." The owner quickly pointed toward the back. But then Moretti noticed Bruce, the only customer who hadn't looked up. Bruce lifted another piece of food with his chopsticks. He didn't stare. He didn't react. He simply continued eating. Moretti stopped walking. His eyes narrowed. One of his bodyguards leaned toward him. "That's Bruce Lee." Moretti slowly turned. "Who?" "Martial artist. He's becoming well known." Moretti looked back at Bruce. Bruce took a sip of tea. Still nothing. A faint smile appeared on Moretti's face. He wasn't used to being ignored. Not by waiters, not by businessmen, certainly not by strangers. He walked toward Bruce's table. His shoes clicked against the wooden floor. Bruce noticed him only when Moretti stopped directly beside the table. "Bruce Lee." Bruce looked up. "Yes?" "You're sitting in my place." Bruce glanced at the empty chair beside him. Then he looked around the restaurant. "I don't see your name on it." A few people lowered their eyes. Someone at the counter almost dropped a cup. Moretti smiled. But there was no humor in it. "You're funny." Bruce calmly returned to his food. "Sometimes." Moretti leaned closer. "You're going to finish your meal somewhere else." Bruce looked at him. "Why?" "Because I said so." Bruce studied the man's face for a moment. Then he picked up another piece of fish. "I was eating." Moretti's smile disappeared. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Moretti slowly raised one hand. 4 bodyguards stepped forward. The restaurant suddenly felt much smaller. Bruce placed his chopsticks down. Not because he was afraid. Because he understood that the meal was over. The first bodyguard reached for his shoulder. Bruce moved. It happened so quickly that several people didn't even understand what they had seen. Bruce caught the man's wrist, turned his body, and redirected the larger man's momentum. The bodyguard stumbled past him. Bruce released him. The man crashed against an empty table. The second bodyguard attacked immediately. A heavy punch came toward Bruce's face. Bruce leaned backward just enough for the fist to miss. Then he stepped forward. One short strike. The bodyguard's breath disappeared. He stumbled backward into a chair. The third man rushed in. Bruce didn't wait. He moved sideways, grabbed the man's arm, and used his own momentum to send him across the floor. The fourth bodyguard froze. For the first time that night, fear appeared in his eyes. Bruce stood still. His breathing hadn't changed. 5 seconds. That's all it had taken. Moretti looked around. 4 men who had entered behind him were now scattered across the restaurant. Bruce looked at him. "Were you saying something?" Nobody laughed. Moretti's jaw tightened. He had expected fear. He had received humiliation. And Vincent Moretti was not a man who tolerated humiliation. He slowly removed his hat. "Interesting." Bruce said nothing. Moretti looked at his fallen men. Then he looked back at Bruce. "You're fast." Bruce picked up his tea. "You're observant." One of the bodyguards slowly stood. "Boss, let me—" "Stay down." The bodyguard stopped. Moretti's eyes never left Bruce. "I've heard stories about you. Most stories aren't accurate." "I don't think that's true." Moretti pulled out the chair opposite Bruce and sat down. Bruce stared at him. Moretti smiled again. "You know what I like about men like you?" Bruce didn't answer. "You believe you're different." Bruce took another sip of tea. "I don't believe anything about you." That answer made Moretti's expression harden. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. A quiet laugh. "Maybe that's why you're interesting." He stood. "Enjoy your dinner." Moretti turned and walked away. But before reaching the door, he stopped. He looked over his shoulder. "Because tomorrow night, you won't be eating." Bruce's eyes narrowed slightly. Moretti walked out. The restaurant remained silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the owner hurried toward Bruce. "Mr. Lee, you should leave." Bruce looked at him. "Why?" "You don't understand who that man is." Bruce looked toward the door. "I understand enough." The owner shook his head. "No, you don't." He leaned closer. People who say no to Vincent Moretti don't usually get a second chance. Bruce looked down at his unfinished meal. Then he quietly said, "Maybe that's his problem." "A quick question for you. If you were sitting in that restaurant and saw 4 dangerous bodyguards go down in 5 seconds, what would you do?" A. Leave immediately. B. Stay and watch what happens next. C. Help Bruce. D. Call the police. And if you're enjoying this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else? Let's see how many different places are following Bruce's story tonight. The next morning, Bruce received a phone call. It came just after 7. He was standing in his training room when the telephone rang. Bruce picked it up. "Hello?" There was silence. Then a man's voice. "Bruce Lee?" "Yes." "You were warned." Bruce's expression changed. "Who is this?" "You should have left the restaurant." Bruce leaned against the wall. "Tell Moretti that threatening me on the phone won't make him stronger." The voice became colder. "This isn't a threat." The line went dead. Bruce slowly lowered the receiver. Something about the call bothered him. Not the threat, the timing. Moretti hadn't simply wanted Bruce out of the restaurant. He had wanted Bruce somewhere else. Bruce walked toward the window. Outside, Los Angeles was beginning another ordinary day. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried to work. Children walked toward school. Everything looked normal. But Bruce knew better. Something had changed the previous night, and he had a feeling that the 4 bodyguards weren't the real danger. That evening, Bruce returned to Chinatown. He walked through a narrow street behind the restaurant. The rain had stopped. The pavement was still wet. He heard footsteps behind him. Bruce stopped. The footsteps stopped too. He continued walking. The footsteps followed. Bruce turned. Nobody. Only an empty alley. He smiled faintly. "You're not very good at this." A figure stepped from the shadows. Then another. Then another. 6 men. Bruce looked at them. One of them was carrying a metal pipe. Another had a wooden club. The largest man stepped forward. "You're coming with us." Bruce looked at him. "Where?" "Mr. Moretti wants to see you." Bruce shook his head. "I don't." The men moved closer. The largest one swung the pipe. Bruce ducked. The pipe struck the brick wall. Bruce immediately stepped inside the man's range, a fast strike to the body. The man doubled over. Another attacker came from the side. Bruce turned, blocked, countered, moved. The alley became a blur of motion. But Bruce wasn't fighting recklessly. Every movement had a purpose. He used the narrow space. He kept the attackers from surrounding him. One man tried to grab him from behind. Bruce stepped forward at the last instant. The attacker stumbled past. Bruce caught his jacket and sent him into another man. 2 went down together. The remaining men hesitated. Bruce looked at them. "Go back." Nobody moved. Bruce took 1 step forward. They ran. Bruce watched them disappear into the darkness. Then he noticed something on the ground. A small black envelope. He picked it up. Inside was a photograph. Bruce looked at it. The photograph showed several young Chinese fighters. They were standing inside an underground gym. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. "Midnight. Golden Dragon Warehouse." Bruce stared at the photograph. Now he understood. This wasn't about dinner. It wasn't even about Moretti's pride. There was something bigger happening beneath Chinatown, something involving fighters, something Moretti desperately wanted to keep hidden. Bruce folded the photograph and placed it inside his jacket. Then he looked toward the dark street. Midnight was only a few hours away, and Bruce had just been given a reason to go. Not because he wanted revenge, because somewhere inside that warehouse, people were being forced to fight. And Bruce Lee had never been good at walking away from someone else's suffering. The clock moved toward midnight, and Vincent Moretti had no idea that the man he had tried to intimidate was now coming directly to him. Midnight came quietly to Chinatown. The streets were almost empty. Most of the restaurants had closed. Storefronts were dark. The neon signs that had made the neighborhood glow earlier in the evening now flickered against wet pavement. Bruce Lee stood across the street from an old warehouse. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Golden Dragon Imports." But Bruce knew it wasn't an import business. Not anymore. The building was too heavily guarded. 2 men stood outside the entrance. Another watched from a second-floor window. And behind the walls came a sound Bruce recognized immediately. The sound of people fighting. Bruce crossed the street. One of the guards stepped forward. "You lost?" Bruce stopped. "No." The guard looked him up and down. "Then you're in the wrong place." Bruce looked at the warehouse. "I don't think so." The guard reached inside his coat. Bruce noticed the movement. Before the man could pull anything out, Bruce stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. The guard tried to resist. Bruce twisted his arm just enough to force him against the wall. The second guard rushed forward. Bruce released the first man and turned. The second attacker threw a punch. Bruce moved inside it. A quick strike to the body. The man dropped to one knee. Bruce caught the first guard before he could recover and pushed him aside. Then he opened the warehouse door. The noise became louder. Hundreds of voices, men shouting, money changing hands, and underneath it all, fists striking flesh. Bruce walked inside. The warehouse had been transformed into an underground fighting arena. A square fighting area stood in the center. There were no proper ropes, only 4 metal posts connected by thick chains. Around it stood dozens of men. Some were gamblers. Some were criminals. Others were fighters waiting for their turn. On the far side of the room, Bruce saw something that made his expression change. Young men. Several of them barely looked old enough to be there. They were bruised, exhausted, and terrified. One fighter sat against the wall with blood on his lip. Another held his ribs. A third stared at the floor. Bruce understood immediately. These weren't professional fighters who had chosen this life. Many had been forced into it. A voice suddenly came from behind him. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Bruce turned. Vincent Moretti stood on a raised platform overlooking the warehouse. This time he wasn't smiling. He wore a dark suit and held a glass in one hand. Several heavily armed men stood around him. Moretti looked down at Bruce. "I gave you a warning." Bruce looked at the fighters. "You're forcing these men to fight." Moretti shrugged. "They're earning money." "They're being threatened." Moretti smiled. "Same thing, depending on who you ask." Bruce stepped forward. One of the men near Moretti shouted, "Get him!" 3 fighters immediately rushed toward Bruce. The first threw a wide punch. Bruce slipped underneath it. The second tried to grab him from behind. Bruce turned and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The attacker stumbled backward. The third came in with a kick. Bruce caught the leg. For a moment, the entire warehouse seemed to freeze. Bruce looked at the man. Then he swept his standing leg. The attacker hit the floor. Bruce released him. The crowd began murmuring. Moretti watched carefully. He wasn't surprised anymore. He had expected Bruce to be fast, but he hadn't expected him to be this calm. More men entered the fighting area. 5, then 7. Bruce backed toward the center. He wasn't surrounded yet, but they were trying to create a circle around him. Bruce's eyes moved from one man to another. He wasn't watching their fists. He was watching their feet. That was where their intentions appeared first. One man shifted his weight. Bruce moved. A punch missed. Another attacker stepped forward. Bruce turned. A strike landed against his shoulder. For the first time that night, Bruce felt the impact. The crowd reacted. The attacker smiled. "You're not so fast now." Bruce looked at him, then smiled. The man attacked again. Bruce stepped aside. The attacker passed him. Bruce caught his arm and redirected him directly into another fighter. 2 men collided. The third attacked. Bruce ducked. The fourth attacked. Bruce moved. A fifth tried to grab him. Bruce broke the grip. Within seconds, the formation collapsed. The men began getting in each other's way. Bruce had turned their numbers against them. One fell. Another stumbled. A third backed away. Bruce stood in the middle of the floor. His breathing was controlled. His eyes remained fixed on Moretti. Is that all? The warehouse became silent. Moretti slowly put his glass down. No. He looked toward the back entrance. Bring him out. The crowd immediately moved aside. A huge man stepped into the light. Bruce's expression became serious. The man was enormous. Broad shoulders, thick neck, heavy arms. He looked less like a fighter and more like a wall that had learned how to move. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Antonio Romano." Another answered, "The Bull." Antonio entered the fighting area. He was bigger than every man Bruce had faced that night. And unlike the others, he wasn't angry. He looked at Bruce calmly. Moretti called out, "Antonio doesn't fight for money." Antonio cracked his neck. He fights because he enjoys it. Bruce looked at him. Antonio smiled. You're Bruce Lee? Yes. I've heard about you. Bruce looked at Antonio's stance. His feet were slightly uneven. His right leg carried less weight than the left. Bruce noticed it immediately. Old injury. Probably the knee. Antonio raised his fists. You're smaller than I expected. Bruce replied, People usually say that. Antonio laughed, then attacked. He moved much faster than Bruce expected. A heavy punch came toward Bruce's head. Bruce blocked it. The impact pushed him backward. Antonio followed with another. Bruce moved away. Another punch. Bruce ducked. Antonio kicked. Bruce jumped back. The crowd erupted. Antonio wasn't just big. He was experienced. He had learned how to use his size. Bruce studied him. Antonio attacked again. Bruce moved left. A punch passed his face. Bruce countered with a quick strike. Antonio barely reacted. Bruce stepped back. Antonio smiled. That's it? Bruce didn't answer. Antonio charged. This time, Bruce waited. At the final instant, Bruce moved sideways. Antonio's momentum carried him past. Bruce struck the side of his body. Antonio turned. Bruce struck again. Antonio grabbed Bruce's jacket. For one dangerous second, Bruce was trapped. Antonio pulled him closer. Bruce felt the enormous strength in the man's arms. The crowd began shouting. Moretti smiled. Antonio lifted Bruce slightly from the ground. Bruce's feet touched down again. Antonio whispered, You should have stayed at dinner. Bruce looked directly into his eyes. You should have fixed your knee. Antonio's smile disappeared. Bruce suddenly shifted his weight. He struck low. Antonio's injured leg buckled. Bruce escaped the grip. Antonio stumbled. Bruce didn't attack him while he was down. Instead, he stepped back. Antonio slowly stood. His face had changed. Now he understood. Bruce hadn't guessed. He had seen the injury. Antonio attacked again, this time angrily. That was exactly what Bruce wanted. The bigger man became reckless. Bruce kept moving. Left, right, forward, back. Antonio's punches became wider, slower, more predictable. Bruce waited. Then Antonio's right foot touched the ground awkwardly. Bruce moved. A rapid combination. One strike to the body, another to the shoulder. Then a final movement that took Antonio completely off balance. The giant fighter crashed onto the warehouse floor. The crowd went silent. Bruce stood over him. He didn't celebrate. He simply offered Antonio his hand. Antonio looked at it. For several seconds, he refused. Then he grabbed Bruce's hand. Bruce pulled him up. Antonio whispered, You're different. Bruce answered, I don't fight people who don't want to fight. Antonio looked toward Moretti. His expression changed. That sentence had meant more than Bruce intended, because Antonio knew exactly what was happening inside the warehouse, and for the first time, someone had said it aloud. Your turn. If you were Bruce, would you trust Antonio after that fight? Yes. Antonio clearly doesn't want to work for Moretti anymore. No. He could still be pretending. Comment yes or no, and tell us which country or city you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more dramatic stories like this one. Antonio walked toward the edge of the fighting area. He looked at Bruce, then at Moretti. I'm done. Moretti's face hardened. What did you say? Antonio repeated himself. I said, I'm done. The warehouse became tense. Moretti slowly stepped down from the platform. You don't decide when you're done. Antonio looked at him. I just did. Moretti nodded toward his men. Several weapons appeared. Bruce immediately stepped between Antonio and the armed men. Moretti stopped. You really want to do this? Bruce looked around. Not here. Moretti laughed. Then where? Bruce looked at the frightened fighters. Somewhere they can't get hurt. Moretti's smile disappeared. You think you're going to walk out of here with all of them? Bruce didn't answer. Moretti turned to his men. Lock the doors! Metal bolts slammed into place. The warehouse erupted into panic. The younger fighters tried to move toward the exits. Guards blocked them. Bruce looked at Antonio. Antonio understood. This is going to get ugly. Bruce nodded. It already is. Then the lights suddenly went out. Total darkness. Someone screamed. A gunshot echoed through the warehouse. People scattered. Bruce heard footsteps approaching from 3 directions. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them. 1 step. 2. 3. Bruce moved. A man rushed past him. Bruce caught him. Another came from the opposite side. Bruce ducked. The attacker struck empty air. Bruce pushed him away. Then a 4th man attacked. Bruce moved through the darkness using sound instead of sight. One by one, the attackers lost their advantage. Antonio joined him. Together, the 2 men created a path through the chaos. Bruce reached the nearest door. He pulled it open. Cold night air rushed inside. Everyone out! The fighters began running. Moretti shouted from somewhere in the darkness, Stop them! But his men no longer knew whom to chase. By the time the emergency lights came back on, half the fighters were already outside. Moretti stood in the center of the warehouse. His face was filled with rage. Bruce stood near the open door, Antonio beside him. For a moment, Bruce and Moretti stared at each other. Moretti pointed toward Bruce. This isn't over. Bruce looked at him. I know. Then Bruce walked away. But as he stepped into the street, Antonio quietly followed. Bruce turned. Why are you coming with me? Antonio looked back at the warehouse. Because you were right. About what? Antonio lowered his voice. Moretti isn't running those fights for money. Bruce's expression became serious. What is he running them for? Antonio looked around to make sure nobody was listening. Then he said, Those fighters aren't his real business. Bruce waited. Antonio continued. The fights are only a cover. For what? Antonio stared at him. Something much bigger. Bruce looked back at the warehouse. The rain had started again, and suddenly the photograph inside his jacket felt much heavier. Because the truth wasn't hidden inside the Golden Dragon warehouse. It was only the entrance. Somewhere behind Vincent Moretti was a secret powerful enough to make an entire criminal organization risk everything. And now Bruce Lee knew too much. Moretti would not let him walk away easily. The next move had already begun. Rain followed Bruce and Antonio through the narrow streets of Chinatown. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Bruce finally stopped beneath the roof of a closed shop. You said the fights were a cover. Antonio nodded. For something much bigger. What? Antonio looked around before answering. Money. Bruce frowned. That's not exactly a secret. No, I'm talking about millions. Antonio explained that Moretti had been using the underground fights to move money through Chinatown. Fighters, gamblers, restaurant owners, and even businessmen were being used without knowing the entire operation. But there was something else. Moretti had discovered that several young fighters were refusing to cooperate, so he had threatened their families. That was why they stayed. Bruce's expression hardened. Where are their families? Antonio hesitated. Some are being watched. Others are being held in safe houses. Bruce looked at him. You know where? Antonio nodded. Most of them. Then we get them out. Antonio stared at Bruce. You don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. Moretti has men everywhere. Bruce looked into the rain. Then we move faster than his men. Antonio almost smiled. You really don't know how to quit. Bruce turned toward him. Neither do you. The next morning, Bruce and Antonio began visiting the families. They didn't confront Moretti directly. They moved quietly. One family was taken from an apartment before Moretti's men arrived. Another was moved through a restaurant basement. A third family was hidden in a small apartment belonging to an old martial arts instructor. But every move came with a price. Moretti quickly realized someone was interfering. And then Bruce received another message. A black envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Linda. Bruce stared at the photograph. His face became completely still. On the back was a message. You should have stayed out of Chinatown. Antonio saw Bruce's expression. What happened? Bruce handed him the photograph. Antonio's face changed. He knows about her. Bruce nodded. Then we don't have much time. What would you do? If someone threatened the person you loved just to force you into a trap, would you A. walk into the trap anyway? B. find another way to turn the trap against them? Comment A or B, and tell us where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying the story, like the video and subscribe. We want to know how many people around the world are following Bruce's journey. That night, Bruce went to the address written on the photograph. An abandoned theater. The doors were open. Inside, hundreds of empty seats faced a dark stage. Bruce walked slowly through the building. Moretti. His voice echoed. Nothing. Then the lights came on. Moretti stood on the stage. Linda was nowhere to be seen. Bruce looked at him. Where is she? Moretti smiled. She isn't here. Bruce's eyes narrowed. You lied. Of course. Several men appeared behind Bruce, then several more. Moretti had planned everything. You're very talented, Bruce, Moretti said. But talent doesn't mean much when you're surrounded. Bruce slowly looked around. Then he smiled. You made one mistake. Moretti frowned. What? You brought too many men? The first attacker rushed forward. Bruce moved. Another followed. Bruce stepped aside. Antonio suddenly appeared through a side entrance. The two men had planned for this. The fight exploded across the theater. Bruce moved between the seats, using the narrow rows to prevent the attackers from surrounding him. Antonio handled the larger men. Bruce moved faster, striking only when necessary. One attacker grabbed Bruce from behind. Bruce broke free. Another swung at him. Bruce ducked. The attacker hit a seat. Bruce pushed him aside. Within moments, the theater was filled with fallen men. Moretti backed toward the stage. For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Bruce walked toward him. You used innocent people. Moretti reached inside his coat. Bruce stopped. Moretti pulled out a gun. Antonio shouted, Bruce! A shot rang out. Bruce moved at the exact moment the weapon fired. The bullet missed. Antonio knocked the gun away. Moretti stumbled backward. Bruce grabbed him by the collar. For a second, the entire theater went silent. Moretti expected a punch. Bruce didn't give him one. Instead, Bruce released him. You're not worth becoming like you. Sirens suddenly sounded outside. Moretti looked toward the doors. Police officers entered. Antonio had already contacted them before the confrontation. Moretti's empire was beginning to collapse. But before the police took him away, Moretti looked at Bruce. You think this is over? Bruce stared at him. No. Moretti smiled. There are people above me. Bruce said nothing. Moretti was taken away. Antonio looked at Bruce. Did you hear him? Bruce nodded. Someone else is behind everything. Bruce looked toward the dark stage. The fight with Moretti was over, but the mystery had just become bigger. And somewhere in Los Angeles, someone far more powerful had just learned that Bruce Lee was coming. 3 days passed after Vincent Moretti's arrest. Chinatown slowly returned to normal. The underground warehouse was closed. The young fighters had been reunited with their families. Antonio had disappeared from the streets, choosing to leave the criminal world behind. But Bruce couldn't forget Moretti's final words. There are people above me. One evening, Bruce returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. He sat at the same table, the same chair, the same quiet corner. The owner placed a cup of tea in front of him. You came back. Bruce smiled. I never finished my dinner. The owner laughed nervously. Then the restaurant doors opened. A well-dressed older man entered alone. He looked at Bruce. Bruce immediately recognized him. Not from the streets. From the photograph Antonio had shown him. The man had been standing behind Moretti during several meetings. The real boss. He slowly approached Bruce's table. My name is Edward Kane. Bruce looked at him calmly. I know. Kane sat down. You destroyed a very profitable operation. Bruce took a sip of tea. Good. Kane smiled. You could have walked away. So could you. Kane leaned closer. You don't understand how powerful I am. Bruce looked directly into his eyes. Power doesn't impress me. Kane's smile disappeared. You're making a mistake. Bruce stood. No. He placed money on the table. The mistake was thinking I was afraid. Kane watched Bruce walk toward the door. Then he called out, Bruce. Bruce stopped. Kane's voice became quiet. This city has many dangerous men. Bruce turned. And? Kane smiled. You're one of them. Bruce answered, Only when someone gives me a reason. Then he walked out into the night. One last question. After everything Bruce went through, would you have walked away like Bruce? Or would you have stayed to confront the man behind Moretti? Comment, walk away, or confront him. And tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you want more Bruce Lee stories. The rain began falling again. Bruce disappeared into the Chinatown streets. Behind him, the restaurant lights remained glowing. The fight was over. Moretti was gone. His organization had collapsed. But Bruce knew something important. The most dangerous enemy isn't always the man standing in front of you. Sometimes, it's the man watching from the shadows. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Edward Kane was already planning his next move.